So we're in our third week of this longer format. I would love to start off. I'd love to get an understanding. What do you think of this so far? Is there information here that you're enjoying? Do you want me to dive into other topics? Any feedback that you want to give me would be super helpful. Today, we're going to go into CBMs. You may have seen me hashtagging CBMs, and that's for a number of reasons, right? But are you thinking like, what are CBMs? I was having a conversation yesterday about this, and what CBMs are cannabis-based medicines. And firstly, the idea came up because Instagram stops us from tagging. If you start talking about cannabis, even though it is a legal medicine in a number of jurisdictions now, if you start talking about it, it's going to be, if some of you that follow along are now watching this, you're going to be like nodding your head because you're experiencing this as well. If we're talking constantly about cannabis and cannabis and cannabis, everyone's trying to write it in different ways. It's just CBMs, cannabis-based medicines. The first and foremost, it's a branding exercise. It's repositioning, not only in how we talk about this on social media, but also how we bring this into discussion and what the significance is. And the significance of talking about CBMs and cannabis-based medicines, CBMs, rather than cannabis, is also very essential when we start looking at where we are in the world and what the place of cannabis is. While we're seeing increased adoption, we keep on talking about these adoption trends. If you've been watching the last 2 years, the last 2 episodes, and simply adoption trends, how many people are being able to access cannabis and what does that look like increasingly over time when we're able to say, let's sample the last 10 to 15 years, right? And what we see is that increasingly around the world, more people are starting to see cannabis for what it can be, rather than how we did see it through a lens of prohibition that continued to roll out, yeah? So then looking at the exercise of, well, how do we further educate and how do we further change the stigma and the misinformation that went around devil's lettuce, yeah, and around the certain lies and the myths that we heard continuously about cannabis. Now, I don't know where you were raised, but to give you a little bit of a story, like I was raised in Sydney in Australia, and part of the curriculum was that we would have this little giraffe called Healthy Harold that would come and talk about a range of items, and maybe it was on a yearly basis. I can't remember. I'm approaching 40 soon, so I can't remember it all. But anyway, Healthy Harold would come and Healthy Harold would present different health information to the kids, myself, my peers back then. And one time it was very evident where Harold was at in his trajectory. He came in wearing sunglasses one day. I think he was smoking a cigarette as well, and he was clearly under the influence of certain compounds. And I don't remember everything, but it was very clear that Healthy Harold was saying that drugs are bad, right? Drugs are bad, right? Grew up in a family where drugs are bad, and the repositioning of what cannabis did for me as a cancer patient and what my family ended up seeing and how it reduced my symptoms and gave me quality of life, then placed my family in a situation where we were then able to see it as a medicine, right? A lot of us who are having stories, personal stories with loved ones or within ourselves, are able to see that, hey, cannabis is actually a medicine. But how do we unpack it? How do we unpack what cannabis is, particularly when there is a perception still that cannabis is just about getting high? And certain parts of the industry haven't made that better, because a lot of the money that has been possible and that we've seen when you look at different modeling in international markets, and then also the growth in areas like Australia, a lot of that growth seems to suggest that harm minimization, adult recreational markets is the place to go, right? So if we're on that trajectory and a lot of the industry is focused on how do we just expand into wider markets to be able to get adult use, the question then becomes, well, what happens to the patients that get left behind? And where is the credibility of cannabis as a medicine? So if we just continue talking about cannabis as a way, I don't think we enable maybe future generations or patients in 3, 5, 10 years, if you're thinking ahead, to then be able to have cannabis-based medicines as a standardized first-line therapy. Now, what that means, and I think we've kind of covered this before, but first-line therapy means that you don't have to have exhausted all options. You don't need to be someone that has a prescription of opioids and you need to demonstrate that that wasn't effective for you, or go through different range of tablets that you have. When you're a cancer patient, you need to eat 4 of them at once when you can take 1 cannabis product, right? And ideally, it is an oil or another form where it's not going to be impacting you at all. And again, not trying to get any flower enthusiasts offline here. I'm a big supporter of all forms of cannabis. Personally, I believe that the future of cannabis-based medicines are different formats, and the way that we get to expand into these wider markets is by repackaging cannabis so that the patient and consumer also gets to see how this kind of transitions from early stages of where we are to kind of building out that model. So if you're still keeping on track with this, I'm going to dive into this a little bit more, right? So if we're looking at phases and we're going to sample, say, the Australian market, for example, right? Cannabis has been legal now through certain pathways that have been set up by the Australian government for around 7 years. There was an interesting report that has been published, and you could have referenced this throughout the week, where we covered it at OnTracka. And really what we outlined is that this article could be, this article could be pivotal. This publication can be pivotal to being able to highlight where we are going wrong with cannabis-based medicines and psychiatric disorders, right? Psychiatric disorders, what we're talking about there is mental health, right? So mental health conditions that at present and we're seeing this, are continuously rising, and we know from focusing on psychedelics and where we're going to go with psychedelics that there is great hope. And in many ways, we're living through the golden age of psychiatry at the moment because of the new tools and the new research, which is demonstrating how beneficial things like ketamine for depression, psilocybin for a whole range of indications, ayahuasca, even MDMA, which isn't a classic psychedelic, but is something which is going to be available for many patients soon in Australia with PTSD. And there's wonderful progression always happening on a weekly basis, monthly basis. So we could just do a full update maybe in the coming weeks to say this is where we're at and the pace of change, which is incredible. But while we're seeing the pace of change for psychedelics with mental health or psychiatric conditions, we need to just do a little pause on, okay, well, what's happening in a jurisdiction which is regulated, and what's happening in terms of total numbers of how many patients with mental health conditions are able to access different cannabis CBMs to be able to help them with their psychiatric conditions, which could include anxiety, depression, PTSD, sleep-wake disorders, etc. So if we're to have a look in the past 7 years, as indicated in our article, which you can cross-reference, we've seen approximately 101,000 patients that have been able to integrate and be prescribed cannabis-based medicines, prescriptions, 101,000 prescriptions that have been used by patients to support them with their psychiatric conditions, And there's 2 ways to look at this. One would be like, that's fantastic. And firstly, again, we've got to applause when we've got to get behind the industry. And while we can have dialogue, we also need to acknowledge the good work that is being done. So applause is required for the progress that's been made, the prescribers in Australia and the patients that are accessing these medicines in Australia to be able to support them. Now, the biggest thing is that we don't know what's happened. So we've got, and that equates to just over 30%. I think it's 36% around. We will ensure that's correct when you see below. But we're seeing that total prescriptions for legal medical cannabis, CBMs, in Australia is for mental health related conditions. And so that would place you in a situation where everything is going well. And it's been 7 years, we're getting to this point, 100,000 prescriptions, fantastic. Again, applause needed because it is. But if we then zoom out, and we zoom out to see, okay, what has been going on in these past 7 years? Well, let's just think about what's happened in the last 3 years, with everything that went on in terms of lockdowns and the impact that that had continuously on individuals. And now we're facing a whole range of different uncertainty. There's like rising interest rates. There's a lot that's going on in this world, which is continuously keeping people separated. And we're seeing increased mental health challenges in the community. So the great hope is psychedelics are going to come in, but we know, we see through some emerging data that cannabis can have a play in this as well. But if we're looking at standard of care and standard policies, cannabis isn't making an impact at all. So we see that from 2020 to 2021, we saw 44.4 million prescriptions for psychiatric conditions in Australia. And then what we've seen is that CBMs have been prescribed 101,000 times in the past 7 years. Now, again, let's think about it. It took a while for prescriptions to start, and it didn't really ramp up to the last few years. So let's be kind and say we are on the path, which is great. Because I think where the article came from outlined a number of different points. And one of them is that the information that is lacking around the safety profile and how effective these medicines can be, CBMs can be, for treating and supporting people with mental health conditions. That was super evident. So if we just pause and do a snapshot of the last few years to see the trajectory, it is on the way up, but it's less than the total number of prescriptions sampled in the last 7 years. If we just look at 1 year where there's 44.4 million prescriptions, we're seeing that this is so insignificant and not having an impact, which means there are so many patients in Australia that are utilizing this through other means, self-medicating through illicit green, gray, black markets, or simply in a position where they do not see CBMs as something that could be supportive to their mental health. And that's either through miseducation or not enough education for patients to be informed and understand that this can be a viable treatment option for them. And secondly, one of the biggest blockers for this is a lot of those prescriptions, the 44.4 million prescriptions, are done via a GP, which means this is done in the community, again, which highlights that GPs in Australia don't have enough confidence in how safe and how effective CBMs can be for treating mental health disorders, right? And so if that's where we're at, then we've got a decision to make. What are we going to do about that? Are we just going to say, okay, there's not enough data, we're going towards a market which is now going to be tailored towards where we see future revenue going and commercial opportunities to make cannabis scheduled and accessible to adult or recreational markets? Or are we going to be serious about, well, let's collect some of this data or the data to then help expand these markets and give prescriber and regulatory confidence so that we can ensure that more patients can access CBMs to support them in their journey? And if we got to think about it, well, what do we know about existing approaches to psychiatry and the medications that have been used? In many ways, there haven't been many new drugs in the past 20 years. Now, if we're to rely on some of the research, if we're having a look at classic psychedelics which are coming in, when we do a study to then be able to compare something like Lexapro to psilocybin, it is very interesting to show that efficacy seems to be, and there's further studies that are required, but efficacy is about the same. But when you drill into some of the secondary outcomes from this one particular study, we then see that the safety profile, i.e. psilocybin doesn't have as many of unwanted side effects as some of these SSRIs. we start painting a picture that, well, hey, if I'm going to get the same outcome, but I'm not going to have these really awful unwanted side effects, well, this does present a much better picture, but not always, the research doesn't always look at it that way. So that was the psilocybin example. But if we're going to come back to the utility or how cannabis can be used, we need doctors to be assured that, hey, is this safe? And is it going to help people? And if it is going to help people, is it going to help a lot of people? And how by how much is it going to support people? And what form of cannabis is going to be used to be able to support people? Is it going to be a flower and we're going to get someone to go vape it? Is it something that then they're going to go and smoke as a flower, maybe traditionally like through a joint or through a pipe? Or is it going to be something which the customer and the patient is already familiar with, and it's going to come in a pill format, maybe a drink, maybe it could be a little gummy or an edible as well, like we're seeing in vitamins, right? So the whole idea is like, how does it convert? How do we convert from where we are to where we need to get to? Where we need to get to is better access and better understanding of how CBMs can be used to support individuals that are struggling at the moment. And is there an intersection between CBMs and psychedelics, right? Because what we're seeing at the moment is, if you're using cannabis, you can't be using ketamine, or you can't be using anything as well, because that's abuse. Well, that's a pretty outdated approach. If we're looking at these as medicines where they can overlap together. Yes, so I remember a time when I was a cancer patient and I would have to get an infusion every 3 weeks. So I'd have to get an infusion every 3 weeks. And at that time, a lot of people would say, I was taking cannabis and I was taking a certain form of cannabis that I'm not going to go into today. And I know I'm going for a little bit longer, so I'll finish up. But the way that I was consuming cannabis as a stage 4 cancer patient, it was the first thing that I did a day and how I finished my day. And that wasn't like macro doses. So I wasn't having large doses. I was having small, very frequent doses of this, so it was continuously in my system, yeah? So I was out there one day, a new cancer patient was coming in, starting a treatment, and they were provided with 4 different medicines. 4 different medicines and told, this is what you need to take on a daily basis if you got nausea, and this is what you've got to do, A, B, and C. I remember just thinking, you got one option that you could take, which eliminates all of that. But again, this is 2015, so I was just someone talking a lot of nonsense and would have just appeared to be a bit of an idiot. As I said, got called regularly back in the day. So when we have a look at that example, it's already like very common for an individual, and you'll notice if you're a patient, you're going to get prescribed a whole heap of things. You know, if it's for pain, or if you've got mental health challenges, or if it's for nausea, you're going to be provided with multiple things, and that's okay. But if you're going to use a CBM and then you may be utilizing that as preparation to maybe get yourself off other stuff, or just to be able to reset how you are, because you know equilibrium for you is at a point where cannabis comes in, works with your endocannabinoid system to be able to regulate and create equilibrium. And then you've got the deeper tools of psychedelics to be able to come in, which don't need to be used as frequently. Then you can see cannabis coming back into the picture afterwards to be able to support individuals. That for me is the future of healthcare, not, oh no, you can't be mixing cannabis and psychedelics because you're a drug addict. Like, that is outdated. That is outdated. But the challenge, and we're shooting ourselves in the foot every day because there's no data, because we're not collecting information to be able to help change these very outdated views, and views that have got a lot of support and vested interest to say this isn't possible, and let it stay on the periphery. So let it just be adult and recreational, because that's where a market is and there is going to be wealth created there. But the real value is eating into profits, right? In terms of healthcare and pharmaceuticals, and creating cannabis-based medicines that can be used as a first-line therapy for patients with a whole range of indications to be able to get benefit from and to be able to get support from. What I'm on this rant about and what I'm talking about, and if you're still watching me fantastic. Please leave some comments below. If I have missed anything, let me know. You can see I'm super passionate about this, and it's, I've dedicated my life to this issue, and I've seen it firsthand with myself, with my mother, with my doctors. Data is the issue. So if we're looking at increasing the impact that cannabis can have for patients with mental health disorders, because currently we're minimal, so small. If we want to increase that to get 10%, 20% of market, we need to provide credible information, credible research, and be able to demonstrate safety at scale, how effective CBMs can be for treating a whole range of different conditions, and having the right controls in place, the right data integrity, the right structure, the right individuals, and doing this to be able to ensure that we can move beyond the current paradigm that we're stuck in, where we see cannabis as, you can fill in those gaps, but it's not this wonderful age that we're living through like psychedelics. It's kind of like, the cousin over there, the black sheep of the new psychotropic world. And I think we need to change that, and we can change that together. My name is Chad Walkaden. I am the founder at OnTracka. We are in a pursuit of being able to fill the black hole of data that exists around psychotropic medicines, and we can get there together. So if you want to join the journey, please contact myself, any of my team. Download OnTracka now, check out our website, follow on, leave some comments today, because all of this helps. But start taking control, be an advocate for your own health by understanding how CBMs or psychedelics impact your health. Thank you very much. Have a lovely weekend.